Okay, today we're going to talk about and discuss and compare the effects of World War I and World War II, both the immediate effects and the long-term effects. In previous lessons, we've gone over the overviews of the war and compared the causes and discussed the causes of the wars. The vocabulary words we need today. Treaty of Versailles, remember, was the World War I treaty that punished Germany for World War I, basically causing World War II. The United Nations is the League of Nations version 2.0. It's the second attempt at an international multi-nation organization after 1945, designed to keep world peace and later to deal with world issues. Designed immediately to keep world peace, and then its mission creeped to just be a general place to examine world issues. The Cold War was a roughly 45-year conflict between the United States, one superpower after the World War II, and the Soviet Union, the USSR, the second superpower after the war. And finally, the term military-industrial complex. It's two forces. Number one, the technology business, anyone who could build, research, or sell something to the military through the government, and the actual military, wanting more technology and equipment, so they sort of work together politically to achieve their goals and to drive political laws and policy that create more military, create more technology, create the need and desire for more military technology. Okay, so let's take ourselves into the immediate effects of World War I. I'm talking anything during the war or anything right after the war, all right? So right at the end of the war, immediate effect of the Treaty of Versailles. I guess it's a way to say the Allies decided to punish Germany, and that was a leading cause of World War II. We see that over and over and over. Do not punish your defeated enemies of war, rebuild. In World War I, they punished Germany. Germany came back for anger and revenge, and we see at the end of World War II, Japan and Germany became friends because the U.S. and other allied nations occupied them for 5 years, but then left with a strong friendship. So after World War I, it took about 5 years, some a little longer, for the countries to rebuild. This is not as amazing to me as in World War II. We'll get to that with World War II, because the cities weren't impacted as much in World War I, but it is amazing how fast and how quickly a nation can come back after the most devastating war of all time. Okay, there was more loss of life and wounded than any other war of history. Okay, World War I was the most loss of life and wounded of all time, most devastating war of absolute numbers. Now, this is another absolute numbers versus percentage, and you could find wars and conflicts that would have destroyed a higher percentage of whatever category you're talking about. But whether it be land, resources, people, cities. But when you talk absolute number just of life lost and wounded, World War I was on the top. An immediate effect of World War I is that nations really invested in military technology, not just building up a military, but really trying to innovate and use what they invented in World War I. So we see over the next 2 decades, tanks go from 3-mile-an-hour behemoths to the mobile Panzer division of Germany, unbelievable tank advancement. Airplanes go from basically nothing into, for World War II, we had metal propeller, always propellered, no jets, bombers and fighter planes. Machine guns went from stationary machine guns to personal machine guns for an individual soldier. There was limited navy. In World War I, I get it, there was submarines and U-boats. Well, everything got better. The submarines got better. But also we see these huge, massive aircraft carriers being built, battleships and destroyers. So the Navy went through incredible advancements. And all of that right immediately during and after World War I. Okay, an immediate effect of World War I was the creation of a multinational, international peacekeeping organization called the League of Nations. Now, it failed. Spectacularly failed, but it was the first, and it set the stage for later. It failed because of very low national involvement. Major nations, such as like the United States, were not part of it. The group had no military. All they could do is offer a forum for talking and negotiation. And if an aggressor nation didn't want to talk and negotiate, then the League could do absolutely nothing. And so then you have Japan and Hitler They were absolutely uninterested in actually keeping peace, and so the League couldn't stop them. Okay, an immediate effect of World War I was the enacting of the Armenian genocide by the Ottoman Turks, and we're going to see that atrocities happen under the veil of war over and over. When large wars happen, there's massacres, genocides, and atrocities. And this is for multiple different reasons. Number one, war is a distraction event. So many people don't even know what's going on at the time. And so nations or people can get away with atrocities. And even if people knew, everyone is incredibly busy at trying to win the war. And so stopping a massacre or stopping a genocide becomes sort of put off, I notice in history, where people concentrate more on the actual war effort. You'll have to do more research to find out the exact causes and effects, but there is the story of a Polish secret agent who went into a German concentration camp voluntarily to see what was going on. I believe his name was Ivan Pilecki, Polish. You can find that. And he made reports about the atrocities happening in the war crimes happening in German concentration camps. But the Allies were distracted with war. They got the reports, but yet did not act on the reports of German war crimes. And you'd have to do more research, but most likely that's because they made the decision to try to focus only on winning the war. We see in human nature, when war happens, it's a very stressful time, and groups become even more so the other. They become scapegoats in a country for all the negative emotions or anything that's going wrong before the war or during the war. So minority groups become so much more the other during the wars, and that's when we see historical hatreds come out and all the negative actions and emotions. And finally, sometimes ethical and moral choices are made not in a vacuum, but in context with what else is going on. So if everything's going well and everything is peaceful, the moral and ethical choices match. Or if a bad one would happen, it would stand out so much more and people might not do it or they would notice it. But during war, so many ethical and moral bad decisions are made during war because you have to, the orders are given to go and take cities and bomb cities, and so many people are dying and innocent people are dying. And because of that, it seems like nations aren't outraged by the treatment of minorities in those nations. So when so many other horrible things are happening, it seems like atrocities and massacres just slide right in without without a majority of people rising up against, if they know about it, rising up against that. I guess a way to say it is, during peacetime, take a group of soldiers. During peacetime, they would never think of doing inhuman, awful things to people. But now, put them in a war situation and you get things such as the rape of Nanking. As a Japanese atrocity on the Chinese. Now take those same Japanese soldiers, put them in peace, have them visit a city for vacation. They're not going to do the massacre or atrocity. But when war is happening, it seems like different choices are made. And finally, an immediate effect of World War I was the Russian Communist Revolution. Russia turned communist right in the middle of World War I. Well, why was that? The Russian people had had a revolution. The Tsar was gone. The Tsar was gone, and they had a freedom revolution. They had freedom and a new government. But the new government, Russia, was still in the war, and the people were facing no fuel and no food for the harsh Russian winter. Because of this, the people were desperate, and history had proven, for 70 years before the Communist Revolution, history proven nobody wants a communist revolution. In 70 years, there was never a communist revolution, and there was never serious, critical number of people ever supporting communism enough to make it happen. And most likely, that's because the majority of people did not want communism at all. Except in Russia, they were facing imminent, guaranteed starvation in the winter, and they became so desperate that the people backed the communists. And the communists won another revolution in Russia, and Russia went communist. Okay, let's get into some immediate effects of World War II, right? We have the same 5 to 10 years rebuilding, although My amazement is even more with World War II, because World War II had all the cities. The cities were bombed, and most of the buildings within every city that was bombed was touched at least a little bit of bomb. So just the cities were reduced to rubble, and the fact that they were able to be rebuilt within 5 years amazes me when a country focuses on rebuilding how much they can do. Okay, now World War I was more loss of life and wounded than any other war. World War II beat those numbers out. World War II is now the leader, and it is arguable that World War II caused more property damage than any other war in history. Since World War II, there's been multiple wars and multiple genocides, and none were as large or as consuming as World War II. I think an immediate effect of World War II worth noting is the dropping of the first atomic bombs, and they were dropped on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We're going to put this in a special category, whether it should be an immediate effect or not. I think it's worth noting. These are the only 2 times an atomic bomb was used in war against people. There have been thousands of test booms, is what I call them, atomic bomb tests. Thousands of nuclear weapons exploded in test booms, but they are not directed at people and not during war. Okay, an immediate effect of World War II is the Soviet Union, the USSR, expanded territory. They took more territory. Similar to how the Armenian genocide happened in World War I, World War II was a veil for another genocide. It was called the Holocaust. Hitler and his top officials ordered the deaths of 6 million European Jews. So the genocide was going on at the same time as the war. 2 separate yet connected events in history happening at the same time. Hitler did enact massacres and atrocities against other minority groups, Russian Soviet prisoners of war, LGBTQ people, mentally and physically disabled people, and those were happening at the same time as the Holocaust. I should note that Japan was also engaged in war crimes and atrocities. Coming to mind is a massacre at the city of Nanjing called the Rape of Nanjing, where men, women, children killed innocent civilians in the tens of thousands in horrible and brutal ways, and those that survived were violated and scarred for life. War crime, atrocity. An immediate effect of World War II was after the war, there were war crimes trials. The top German officials were put on trial for war crimes, making war and the atrocities they did. Many top German officials committed suicide. Almost all of them were convicted, and almost all of them were sentenced to death. I think maybe only 1 or 2 were sentenced to prison terms of the top officials, one being Baldur von Schirach, who led the Hitler Youth, a Boy Scout-like scouting group that was designed to create soldiers and indoctrinate children, boys, into the thinking of the Nazis. He was given a prison sentence because technically all he really did was be a teacher of Nazi propaganda, according to the trials, so he was spared death. He did not engage in war itself. The Japanese high generals and military officials, there was war crimes trials there too, and I believe the majority were sentenced to prison terms for the duration of the U.S. occupying Japan, which was like 5 years or so, and I believe that was the result of the Japanese war crimes trials. Okay, let's examine the long-term effects. First, the long-term effects of World War I. I would consider these anything that reached well into the 20 years between World War I and World War II, and of course some of them reach all the way through the decades. So, one of the most probably important long-term effect of World War I was the idea of an international peace organization. So, yes, the immediate effect was they formed the League of Nations, which failed spectacularly, but the idea of a peace organization, that was Woodrow Wilson's, the President of the United States, idea, what he really wanted after World War I. And the idea was there, and the United Nations after World War II filled that idea, and it worked on and off probably better having it than not having it. So the idea was born after World War I. We have the end of kings. Like straight up, end of European kings. And that was a lot of the countries with a king, with kings. So when they went, really the share of monarchies in the world declined very, very heavily. And I mean, there's still monarchies going through the world today, some with more power than others. In fact, there's still some European kings and queens, but they do not share the political power even close to what they had before World War I. So World War I was really the end, the last political power of the kings of Europe. Women's suffrage was kind of an immediate effect. Women in the United States and in the UK gaining the right to vote. It's really more of a long-term effect. it was a long-term shift in attitudes of gender equality, and some of that is from, it was a long multiple hundred-year fight for gender equality, sort of peaking and coming to the culmination. Number two, the incredibly increased demand for and role for women's work and help during the war, offering new opportunities, new responsibilities, new roles in society where as people can see themselves in new roles, others can see themselves in new roles. Big mental change. Long-term effect of World War I was also the lost generation just in lives. So imagine more millions of men died in a 5-year period than ever before in a war. And since men and women were equal in numbers of the time, and pretty much an incredibly high percentage of people got married, over 90%. So what that means at the time, for every man who died in the war, so for every, let's say from the UK who died, or was severely wounded, that would mean one less family unit and one woman who would never get married. I believe it was called a surplus 2 million was a term they used. And there's some books out there that do research on it. And so now what we have is a generation of women that are fiercely independent, finding their way in the world without doing what had come before for generations, which was to pair up in a marriage. And so we have a generation of fiercely independent women, furthering women's rights and differing roles in society. A pretty long term, at least for a couple decades, was the Europeans really got into the Middle East. So Israel, Palestine area, the Iraq area really got really right in the Middle East there, got a lot of Europeans colonizing or imperializing the nations there. And finally, we get what's called a lost generation. And so historians are saying it's a lost generation because a lot of things were lost in World War I, not just the lives that were lost, but ideas, faith in the systems, faith in the future, faith in humanity was lost. Everything had seemed roughly figured out. People were going with Enlightenment ideas, the steady rise of democracy, the steady rise of more human rights, the steady rise of life expectancy, the steady rise of standard of living from the Industrial Revolution. Technology was progressing forward, and it all seemed like that's how it was always going to go. Slow, steady progress, making life better for the majority of people in the United States, Canada, Europe. And then the war threw everything, that ideas out of the window. People started having questioning their governments, their kings, questioning what was right, what was wrong, questioning existence, questioning whether it was all worthwhile. There's even a writing genre that came along, existentialism, that basically said nothing mattered. Literally nothing mattered. Existentialism. And so we got a lost generation. I mean, it is important to look up if that lost generation is really focused on the people of Europe, because let me tell you, the Roaring 20s, like a year after the war in the United States, we're talking jazz, we're talking unbelievably exuberance, live life for the moment. I mean, I guess that comes in from the idea that war could happen at any time and you got to live life for the moment, but that doesn't really sound like a lost generation to me. We don't call it the lost 20s. We call it the Roaring 20s in the United States. So this lost generation might be much, much more of a European idea. I'd like to look into that more. For sure, the Europeans were hurt much more with World War I than the United States was. So if any generation is going to find difficulty dealing with reality after the war, it would be people from Europe where the war was fought. Okay, so coming off of World War II ending in 1945, another roughly 5-year war, we get into a period of the Cold War, the U.S. versus the USSR as superpowers, and there are plenty of things that happened that World War II set up. Just the fact that there was the war, throwing the world into turmoil, really sets up the beginning of the end for many things and the beginning of the beginning for many other things. Okay, very good. Now, first off, not saying the world got it right, but they tried international peacekeeping organization again. Okay, the League of Nations 2.0. They called it the United Nations. At first, it was created just to keep peace, and more nations were invited. More nations said yes. So more nations were part of it, and it had a military. So it could actually back up peace instead of just ask for peace. Okay. For the first time officially in history, there's this idea of war crimes and the idea that genocide is bad. Now, okay, everyone knew genocide was bad and war crimes were bad in the past, but what I mean by that, no, is the world's not going to take it anymore. They wanted to end it. They wanted to say, we don't want war crimes to happen again. We don't want genocide to happen again. The United Nations was also tasked with trying to prevent war crimes and genocides. If international courts were created, and if someone did a war crime or a genocide, they would be held to legal standards from it, okay? That is not to say that wars never happened. Wars did happen, okay? Genocide did happen again. Some were prevented, some were punished, and some did happen and were not prevented or punished. But at least the countries of the world are on the same page. They agree this is not something that we want as humanity, and they're working to end it. Okay. In the United States, there was a big push for civil rights. So in World War I, it was kind of like the war that created the spark to enact some serious change in women's rights. Well, in World War II, we see the spark that enacts some serious change in minority rights, especially the fight against black segregation. But it didn't stop there. The movement encompassed what was then turned into called civil rights. So in the 1960s, it wasn't that the U.S. government and laws were created to give minority rights. No, actual civil rights to all people to try to end discrimination and to try to start to end harassment in the workplace and in the schools based upon a multitude of protected classes. Race, color, religion, national origin, genetic code, age over 40, sex. All of these became protected classes where discrimination in the workplace and schools became illegal. And so it's tough to say that World War II, shaking up everything, didn't have something to do with that. Of course, the civil rights movement really is down to the people who did it. But the situation of a shakeup of a war tends to ignite change in other areas. We see after World War II the end of European imperialism and Japanese imperialism too. Well, number one, Japan had to stop imperializing. The United States said so. The United States won the war, occupied Japan, and said, hey, you don't have an army anymore. You can't take over people, period. And so the end of Japanese imperialism, 70 years of it, gone, done. End to European imperialism. The hundreds of years of European imperialism, it started to end. And some directly right after World War II, within a couple years, and almost everywhere by 1965, roughly, 20 years later. And this is for a couple reasons. I mean, the world has moved on. Specifically, there's a reason, and that is, think back to what Hitler was doing. Like, Hitler became the embodiment of what not to do. The embodiment of a scary, bad, evil dictator. Basically, almost everything Hitler did with his politics and his war and his thoughts and his genocide became textbook don't do. as in this is the worst humanity has ever produced politically and actionably, all in 15 years. And so what was Hitler doing? He was imperializing. He took over Austria. He took over Czechoslovakia. He took over Poland. Like, literally what he was doing was taking over other countries. What had the European countries been doing for the last 100 years or more? Great Britain took over Australia. Great Britain took over India. All of Africa was basically still in control of European countries. So people started asking, if what Hitler was doing was wrong, why would it be right for England to still be in India? Why? Like, was it wrong only because Hitler tried to take over other European countries? Is that what made it different? Because that's really the only difference. Hitler took over countries. Great Britain took over countries. So the European countries really started to look really hard and say, hey, this is a bad policy, owning other countries. That and the people in the other countries really wanted independence, so they doubled their independence movement. That and the world economy wasn't working too well, and colonies cost a lot of money, but a really big part of that was the fact that Hitler showed the world taking over other countries is evil. And that's not where we want to be as a world. And Japan showed that too, to be fair. So when World War II was done, they had to really search their souls. Should we be taking over other countries? A lot of countries asked themselves. All right. Well, that was it for the powers of the European countries. England wasn't powerful. France wasn't powerful. None of them. Germany was in ruins. Two people rebuilt or weren't destroyed in the first place was the U.S. and the USSR. The U.S. wasn't really touched on the mainland, and the USSR, well, they rebuilt really quickly. And they actually took a lot of money from other communist nations that they forced to be communist. The USSR forced like 5 or 6 countries to be communist and then stole all their money. So the USSR rebuilt really quickly at others' expense. And those were the two superpowers. And for the next 45 years, it was a competition to see what would the world do. Would the world be democratic with freedoms and capitalism of buying and selling? Or would the world become communist, where everyone is equal and the government controls it all? The USSR. Because they literally didn't know which way of life would work. It was a 45-year experiment. Which way of life could come out on top? And in the end, the Soviet Union collapsed under its own inability to produce consumer goods for the people, inability to make the people happy, or enough of them happy, and the Soviet Union collapsed. This was called the Cold War, because the USSR and the USA never actually fought each other, because we would have launched nukes and destroyed the whole world, basically. But there were plenty of conflicts, plenty of little wars, and all at the end of it, it was one side was the US and one side was the USSR. It's called the Cold War. Japan and West Germany. The Allies and the United States occupied the Axis powers. For 5 years, the U.S. was in West Germany, rebuilding them along with England and France. The U.S. was in Japan, totally running it, rebuilding it, changing the laws, changing how things worked. And in the end, the U.S. left with rebuilt Japan, rebuilt West Germany as friends with a protection treaty and a friendship treaty of trade. And to this day, Japan and Germany, now that they're reunited, are the friends of the United States and other European nations. World War II quickly ushered in the era of nuclear weapons as a long-term effect. The world saw the power of basic atomic bombs, and that's just atomic fission. Pretty soon, the nuclear bombs incredibly outpaced the original bomb, and the nuclear bombs, they didn't use fission, they used actually fusion. If you know anything about science, just think of the sun. The bombs, the nuclear bombs the world has today, well, some of the countries, are fusion bombs. They create the power of the sun to create an explosion 1,000 times more powerful than the bombs that ended World War II. They are currently the ultimate weapon. Currently, only a few countries have them. If they all went off, life as you know it would turn into a post-apocalyptic video game. The reason they haven't is because they are so powerful, every country that has it realizes they have to be a weapon of last resort. Because if one person starts using nuclear weapons, all of them are going to be used. And that's devastating. And this is what's called MAD, mutual assured destruction. As long as you know I have a nuclear bomb, you won't set off your nuclear bomb, because there is no first strike. You set yours, mine's definitely going to go. They're on auto trigger. So you don't survive. No one survives a nuclear war. So it has to be the last weapon. So nuclear weapons haven't been used in any war since World War II. And that is a good thing. And finally, we're living in a world you've never known any different. And your parents have never known any different. And their parents had never known any different. It's the world of a military-industrial complex where the need for weapons creates businesses that supply those weapons. So you got two sides of this. And I think one of the US presidents said to beware of this. Was it Eisenhower? Said beware the military-industrial complex because it's going to mess up politics, or at least drive politics in a way you don't want it to. Think about it. What does the military want? Better weapons. More weapons. They want to be a better military. I don't blame them. That's what the military is for. Now you have another side in capitalism. You got the businesses. What do businesses want? Money. So that means you've got to demand the military. And then you're going to have a supply. Wherever there's a demand, someone is going to make it. So now you got these military businesses. Their only job that makes them money is to make weapons and supply the military. And now both of those, the military and the big businesses, of course legally, are going to pressure the politicians to create policies, to fund and to use more tax dollars to get the weapons, to fund the military. And some argue that wars are gone to in order to further military spending and make people more money. Some argue that. It is inarguable that there are strong, powerful forces, and that's what they call the military-industrial complex, that wants to make money by getting more military technology. And why should we beware? Well, it's that same thing about militarism. It started World War I. It started World War II. You have a shiny, brand new, well-equipped army. How do you not use it? The temptation to use it to fix political situations becomes very, very strong. Think back in the last 30 to 40 to 50 years. Let's think back starting from the 70s. How quick have countries been, specifically the US, to use their military as a political tool? Beware the military-industrial complex, says the president. And because of World War II and the Cold War, we live in a world, a world economy that is in large part fueled by weapons of war. And that's pretty much just a listing, and slight discussion, less of a comparison of the effects, both immediate and long-term, of World War I and World War II. All right, thanks for watching.